My stepmother tried to push me out of the family after my dad's death, but I found a letter he left me, and then My name's Jesse, and I'm 25. My dad, Robert, was 56 when he passed away unexpectedly. It's hard to describe the hollow feeling that's settled in me since then, a sort of numbness that doesn't seem to fade. My dad was my rock, the person I could turn to for just about anything. Now he's gone, and the one person left to manage things is Clara, my 52-year-old stepmother, who I've never exactly been close to. My relationship with Clara has always been complicated. She and my dad got married when I was 17, and while I tried to keep things polite, there was a certain coldness between us. She was civil, even friendly sometimes, but I always had this gnawing feeling that she didn't want me around. My dad, ever the peacekeeper, brushed it off as just how she is, and I figured he was probably right. I did my best to tolerate her, but now that he's gone, I'm starting to see another side of her. The funeral was a somber affair, as one would expect. I arrived early, feeling like I had to be there first to greet people on behalf of my dad. But Clara was already there, surrounded by family, friends, and acquaintances, her demeanor icy and composed. I remember feeling out of place, like an intruder at my own father's funeral. She barely looked at me when I walked in, only giving a short nod before turning her attention back to the guests. Throughout the service, she seemed preoccupied, like she had more important things to focus on than mourning. She barely acknowledged me or even mentioned me in her short eulogy, choosing instead to emphasize her years of companionship with my father and her heartache over the loss. There was little mention of my dad's love for his family, his loyalty, his life's work, none of the things he and I would talk about. It was as if she wanted the spotlight solely on her grief, casting me as an afterthought. It stung more than I could express, but I kept quiet. After the service, people approached me to offer condolences, but I noticed a lot of them gravitated towards Clara. She had a way of pulling people in, of making them see her as the suffering widow, while I stood awkwardly at the edge of her world, left to deal with my own grief in silence. My dad's old friends, people I'd known since childhood, seemed colder than I remembered, offering short, sympathetic words before joining Clara's little circle. The whole scene felt surreal, like I was watching from the outside. But the most unsettling part came toward the end of the reception. As people were saying their goodbyes, Clara pulled me aside, her expression carefully neutral. "Jesse," she said in a tone that held none of the warmth a grieving stepmother might show, "it's important that we start thinking about changes." "Changes?" I asked, taken aback. "Yes," she replied, her tone clipped. "There's a lot to settle, and we both have lives to get back to." The implication was clear. My father's absence was something to settle, so we could both move on. I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks, a mixture of anger and hurt that I barely managed to contain. "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully. "We just lost him. There's a lot more to this than moving on quickly." Clara sighed, giving me a pitying look that made my stomach twist. "Look, Jesse, I know this is difficult, but I've been dealing with most of the arrangements. There's only so much you need to concern yourself with." The way she said it, as if I had no real role to play in this, left me stunned. My dad and I had been close. He'd been a constant presence in my life, and now I felt like Clara was subtly trying to erase my place in his memory. Days passed, and each one felt emptier than the last. Without my dad around, I felt a void that I couldn't fill, no matter how much I tried to keep myself busy. But that wasn't all. Little by little, Clara's behavior toward me grew even colder, her comments sharper, her tone more dismissive. She rarely called me, and when she did, it was always about some practical matter regarding my dad's estate. One evening, I visited the house, my dad's house, the one I grew up in, to collect a few things I'd left behind. I knocked, out of respect, but when she opened the door, Clara looked at me with visible irritation, like I was interrupting her day. "You should call ahead next time," she said, her voice clipped. I blinked, taken aback. "I was just coming to get a few things I left here." She folded her arms, blocking my view of the entrance. "Well, the house is going to be reorganized soon, so you might not find things where you left them. We have to move on, Jesse. Move on." That phrase was becoming her favorite mantra, a polite way of saying, "You don't belong here anymore." The house had already changed in small ways. Furniture was rearranged. Family photos I remembered from the walls were nowhere to be seen. My dad's presence was slowly being erased, piece by piece, with Clara orchestrating every detail. Over the next few weeks, it became clear that Clara wasn't interested in keeping me in the loop. Every conversation was short and shallow, and she avoided any talk of the inheritance or how things would be divided. I tried to bring it up once, carefully, but she brushed me off, saying it wasn't the right time to discuss such matters. Yet she'd already started moving my dad's things out of the house, as if she couldn't wait to clear him from her life. Something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, that there was more going on than she was letting on. My dad had always been meticulous with his affairs, careful about planning, and I found it hard to believe that he hadn't left any instructions or documents about what he wanted for me, especially given how close we'd been. One day, when I finally worked up the courage to ask her directly about the will, she scoffed, giving me a pitying smile. "Jesse, there's really not much to discuss. Your father left things simple. I'm taking care of the house, and you'll get what's fair." "Fair?" I asked, bewildered. "I don't even know what's in the will." Her face turned cold, almost calculating. "Your father left things clear enough. I've already spoken to the lawyer. You'll get your fair share. But this was his home with me." Her words sank in like a stone. I felt as though she was deliberately pushing me out, trying to strip me of any connection to my dad's legacy. It was as though she wanted to erase me, to rewrite the story as if I'd never been part of his life. That night, I lay awake, the growing sense of betrayal gnawing at me. It wasn't just about the will or the house. It was the fact that Clara seemed so determined to cut me off, to erase everything that my father and I had shared. I didn't know if I was overreacting or being paranoid, but every instinct told me that there was more to this, that she was hiding something important. My dad had always been careful, always thoughtful, and if he had left something for me, I was going to find it, no matter how hard Clara tried to keep me in the dark. As I tried to navigate life without my dad, Clara's changes to the house came quickly and without warning. I'd gone back a week after the funeral, hoping to retrieve some of my dad's belongings, a few things that reminded me of him. When I walked into the house, though, I felt like I'd entered a stranger's home. The first thing I noticed was the entryway, which my dad had always kept simple, with a few framed pictures of us together over the years. But those photos were gone, replaced by a new, modern piece of abstract art that had no trace of him in it. I walked further inside, noticing even more changes. His favorite armchair, the one he'd sit in every evening, was missing. In its place was a sleek, impersonal love seat that looked like it had been plucked out of a showroom. I found Clara in the living room, rearranging a set of newly purchased throw pillows. She glanced up at me, barely masking her irritation. "Clara, what's going on? What happened to Dad's things?" She let out an exasperated sigh. "Jesse, we need to move on. Clinging to his old things won't bring him back." "But some of those things were important to me," I replied, struggling to keep my tone calm. "You didn't even ask me." She shrugged, her voice cool. "You don't live here, Jesse. I need to make this place work for me now. I thought you'd understand." Her words hit me like a slap. I didn't live here? This was my home, the only home I'd known for years, and she was treating me like an unwelcome guest. Trying to keep my frustration in check, I asked, "Where did you put his things?" She waved a hand dismissively. "Some things went to storage, and others, well, I donated a few items. There's no need to hang on to everything." The hurt lodged in my chest was almost physical. She'd gotten rid of his belongings without even a word to me, as if his memory was something to be swept away, boxed up, and forgotten. I could feel my anger rising, but I knew that confronting her head-on wouldn't get me anywhere. Clara had a way of turning everything around, of making me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. In the days that followed, Clara's efforts to erase my dad's presence from the house became even more apparent. Family photos were replaced with stark, modern decor, and every trace of him vanished, bit by bit. When I walked around the house, it was like he'd never been there, like our lives together were nothing more than a shadow she was determined to banish. One evening, as I walked past the study, I noticed that it, too, had been transformed. My dad's collection of old leather-bound books was gone, replaced by sleek, empty shelves. His desk, where he'd spent countless hours reading and writing, was nowhere to be found. I felt a surge of grief and anger, a mix of emotions that I struggled to control. I knew I had to say something, so I went to find Clara. She was in the kitchen, making tea, looking as though everything was perfectly normal. "Clara, why did you get rid of Dad's things without talking to me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned, raising an eyebrow as if I'd just asked the most unreasonable question. "Jesse, I thought we talked about this. We need to move forward. Keeping all those things around isn't healthy." "But they weren't just things," I replied, my frustration slipping through. "They were part of him, part of this family." She looked at me with a carefully neutral expression, and then, with a practiced sigh, she put a hand to her chest. "Jesse, I know this is hard for you, but you have to understand. I was his wife. I'm the one who's here, managing everything. You're an adult now, and you don't live here. You need to start thinking about moving on." The way she said it, as if I were an outsider to my own family, left me speechless. Her eyes held none of the warmth or understanding I'd hoped for. Instead, they were cold, calculating, as if she'd planned each word. She went on, her tone casual, as if discussing the weather. "You know, Jesse, your father's finances weren't as secure as you might think. He left some liabilities. I'm having to work through a lot of unexpected complications, and it might impact what you receive." I stared at her, struggling to process what she was saying. My dad had always been meticulous with money, careful to ensure everything was planned out. The idea that there were liabilities he hadn't mentioned seemed off. "What do you mean?" I asked, unable to keep the suspicion out of my voice. She sighed again, as though she were dealing with a particularly difficult child. "I mean, things aren't as simple as you think. He left me with a lot to handle. I'm doing my best, but don't expect much. You'll get your fair share, but it may not be as much as you hoped." The way she said fair share made my skin crawl. It felt more like a threat than reassurance, a warning that she held all the power here. I knew I was walking a fine line, but I couldn't help myself. Dad never mentioned anything like that to me. He was always so careful. She gave me a tight smile, her eyes steely. "He told me things he didn't tell you, Jesse. Trust me, I know what I'm doing." I felt like I was suffocating. Clara was shutting me out, erasing my dad's presence, and now she was hinting that I might not even have a stake in his legacy. Every instinct in me screamed that she was hiding something, that she was manipulating the situation to keep me out. I spent the next few days haunted by her words, by the possibility that I was losing not just my dad but every part of his life he'd left behind. I tried to let it go, to convince myself that maybe I was just grieving, but every interaction with Clara left me more certain that she was hiding something. Finally, unable to ignore the feeling any longer, I decided to investigate. I began looking for traces of my dad's life that Clara might have missed. Late one evening, when I knew she'd gone out to dinner with friends, I let myself into his study. I sifted through the remaining items she hadn't gotten rid of, hoping to find something, anything, that might give me a clue. As I searched, my fingers brushed against a small, wooden box at the back of one of the drawers. I opened it to find a few personal items, a pen, a watch, and a small envelope tucked underneath. The envelope was old, worn, with my name written on it in my dad's handwriting. My heart pounded as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in my dad's familiar, neat handwriting. The words brought tears to my eyes as I read. "Jesse, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here. I wanted you to know how proud I am of you, and that everything I've done has been with you in mind. Clara and I may not have always seen eye to eye, and I know it hasn't been easy for you. But please remember that you are my son, and you have a right to everything I've worked for. If there's ever a doubt, trust yourself and seek out Gregory. He'll know what to do." Gregory, my dad's lawyer, a family friend I hadn't spoken to in months. I felt a surge of relief and determination. Whatever Clara was hiding, my dad had seen it coming, and he'd left me with a plan. Clutching the letter, I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and strength. Clara might think she could erase me from my father's life, but she was wrong. This letter was my lifeline, and I was ready to fight for the truth. I stood in my dad's study, the worn envelope in my hand. It felt strange, invading his privacy like this, sifting through drawers and boxes, but Clara had left me no choice. Each day brought new signs that she intended to cut me off from my father's legacy. It wasn't just about the money. It was about erasing every trace of his life and our connection. I knew I couldn't let her succeed, and with the letter in my hand, I felt a surge of hope. I took a seat at his desk, hands trembling slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a neatly folded letter, written in my dad's familiar, precise handwriting. For a moment, I couldn't move. It felt like he was there with me, his words bridging the distance between life and death, as if he'd anticipated that one day I would need guidance even after he was gone. Taking a deep breath, I began to read. Jesse, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and I'm no longer there to guide you. First, know that I am so proud of you. You've become a man of integrity and strength, and I know you will handle whatever comes with courage. I'm sorry for any hardships you may face, especially if they stem from my choices. My heart tightened, but I kept reading, his voice practically echoing in my mind. I'm sure that Clara has already begun to make changes around the house. I know her well enough to understand that she may see this as an opportunity to move forward on her own terms. I don't want you to worry. You have a place in my life, in my legacy, and nothing Clara does can change that. I paused, absorbing his words. He had known Clara's character all along. Maybe he'd loved her, maybe he hadn't fully trusted her. Whatever the case, he'd known she might try to take control. His letter continued with detailed instructions. I want you to go to my attorney, Gregory. He's the one I trust to handle these matters fairly. There are documents filed with him, including an updated will and instructions I left specifically for you. Clara has no authority to alter or override these documents. Everything is in place to ensure you are protected. My pulse quickened. Clara's hints about financial difficulties had been lies. My dad had safeguarded my place in the family, foreseeing the very situation I was in. It was hard to believe, but there was a part of me that felt a strange sense of peace. He hadn't abandoned me. He'd anticipated Clara's actions and put measures in place to counter them. I continued reading, and the letter grew more personal. Jesse, I know that family can be complicated, and I know that Clara may not always have shown the kindness you deserve. But I hope that, whatever happens, you hold on to the good memories. Hold on to your place in this family, in our legacy. You are every bit as important as she is, and more. No one can take that from you. The final lines nearly brought tears to my eyes. I love you, son. Take strength from these words, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You have every right to what I've built, and I trust you to honor it well. The letter ended there, but I held it for a long moment, reading his words over and over. I felt a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. My father had not only protected me, but had given me the tools to claim my place. He'd anticipated that I might need help, and he'd entrusted Gregory to ensure that Clara couldn't manipulate or erase what rightfully belonged to me. The next day, I called Gregory, his longtime friend and lawyer, and set up an appointment. When I arrived at his office, Gregory greeted me with a solemn expression, clasping my hand in both of his. Jesse, I was hoping you'd reach out, he said, leading me into his office. Your father entrusted me with documents meant specifically for you, should you need them. He prepared for this, just as he did with everything else in life. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. We sat down, and Gregory began going through the details, pulling out a carefully organized file that contained my father's final wishes, including his most recent will and a few legal protections for the assets he'd built. As Gregory walked me through the provisions, I was stunned by the thoughtfulness my dad had put into everything. Not only had he left clear instructions about the inheritance, but he'd also set up specific clauses that would make it nearly impossible for anyone, Clara included, to challenge my claim. He updated this will shortly after his last hospital stay, Gregory explained, glancing up from the documents. He told me he wanted to be absolutely sure that you'd be taken care of, no matter what. Gregory handed me a copy of the will, and as I skimmed through it, My jaw tightened. It was all there. Clear instructions on how the assets were to be divided, along with detailed statements about my role in the family estate. There were even specific instructions that safeguarded my father's personal belongings, ensuring that I had access to anything I wanted to keep. The weight of what my dad had done left me speechless. He hadn't just thought about my future. He'd gone out of his way to ensure that I would have a place in our family's legacy, a place that Clara couldn't touch. For the first time since his death, I felt a sense of justice, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could see this through. I left Gregory's office that day with a new resolve. My father's letter had given me the strength I needed to face Clara, and I knew that, with Gregory's support and the documents in hand, I could no longer be manipulated or pushed aside. When I got home, I found Clara in the living room, sorting through another pile of newly purchased decor. I took a deep breath, feeling the letter from my dad tucked securely in my pocket, and approached her. "Clara, we need to talk," I said firmly. She looked up, her gaze wary. "Is something wrong, Jesse?" "Actually, yes," I replied, standing tall. "I know about Dad's arrangements. I spoke to Gregory, and he confirmed everything." For the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, though she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Oh, I see," she said, her voice a touch too calm. "Well, I'm sure Gregory explained that your father left everything in my care. I'm handling things as he would have wanted." I shook my head, keeping my voice steady. "No, that's not true. Dad left clear instructions about my place in the estate. He anticipated everything you've done, so don't try to twist this. I have a right to everything he's left me." Her smile faltered, and her eyes narrowed. "You're mistaken, Jesse. There's no need to make this difficult." "I'm not mistaken," I replied, "and I won't let you erase me from his life." Clara's face hardened, her pleasant mask slipping just enough to reveal a flash of resentment. But she didn't respond, simply muttering something about needing to review things before briskly walking out of the room. Watching her retreat, I felt a surge of strength. I wasn't going to let Clara rewrite my father's legacy, nor would I let her erase the connection he and I had shared. Armed with my father's letter and the legal protections he'd set in place, I knew that I had the power to see this through to the end. For the first time since my dad's passing, I felt like I was truly honoring his memory. The meeting with Gregory had left me both relieved and uneasy. I was reassured knowing that my father had secured my inheritance with legally binding instructions. Yet, the encounter had only solidified one fact. Clara was trying to alter those arrangements. It was no longer just a feeling or suspicion. Gregory confirmed that she'd been pushing for changes, attempting to label my dad's decisions as outdated and irrelevant. When I left Gregory's office, he'd given me a final piece of advice. "Jesse, be careful. Clara is persistent, and she's not afraid to bend the truth to get her way. Make sure you document everything from now on." I took his advice seriously. For the next week, I noticed Clara's behavior intensify. It started with her reaching out to family members, speaking in hushed tones, and giving vague explanations about how I was making things difficult and acting erratically. A few relatives I hadn't spoken to in ages began sending me polite but pointed messages, asking if I was okay or if I needed help. The implication was clear. Clara was painting me as unstable, someone not fit to handle his father's legacy. One evening, my cousin Lily texted me, asking if we could talk. She sounded concerned, and I appreciated her reaching out directly rather than relying on secondhand information. "Jesse, I'm just checking in," she said when we spoke. "Clara told me you're struggling to move on after your dad's passing and that you've been, well, difficult with her. I just want to make sure you're okay." My stomach turned. I could almost see Clara's words taking root, weaving doubt and pity into our conversation. "Lily, I'm fine," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "It's Clara who's making things difficult. She's trying to push me out of everything my dad left behind." There was a pause, and I could sense Lily's hesitation. Clara's influence was working. I could hear the doubt she'd planted in people's minds, twisting the truth to suit her needs. "Well, okay, Jesse," Lily said softly. "Just let me know if there's anything I can do." I thanked her and ended the call, my resolve hardening. Clara was actively trying to undermine me, using whatever means she had to make me look like the problem. The final straw came a few days later when I overheard Clara on the phone in the kitchen. "Yes, he's really struggling," she was saying in a falsely sympathetic tone. "He's lashing out, and it's heartbreaking. I think we need to consider some sort of intervention, maybe a way to ensure he doesn't make poor decisions about his inheritance." I stepped into the kitchen, my voice cutting through her faux-concerned monologue. "Is that what you're telling people? That I'm unstable?" Clara hung up abruptly, spinning around to face me. Her eyes flashed with irritation, but she quickly masked it with a sweet smile. "Jessie, dear, you misunderstood. I was just talking to your aunt. She's concerned about you." "No, you were manipulating her," I shot back. "I know what you're doing. You're trying to paint me as unfit so you can get control of everything." She crossed her arms, her smile fading into a tight, annoyed expression. "Jessie, you're grieving. You're not seeing things clearly. Your father made decisions that may not be, well, ideal. I'm simply trying to make things easier for everyone." I took a step forward, feeling the weight of my father's letter in my pocket. "Easier for everyone? Or easier for you?" Her eyes narrowed, her mask slipping just enough for me to glimpse the resentment underneath. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she said, her voice low and cutting. "You're acting like a spoiled child, clinging to things that don't matter. You don't understand the responsibilities your father left behind." "You mean the responsibilities he left to me," I corrected. "And he did it because he didn't trust you with them." Her face twisted in anger, but she forced a brittle smile. "Believe whatever you want, Jessie, but I'm not going to let you sabotage everything I've worked for just because you can't move on." It was clear now. Clara didn't see me as family. She saw me as an obstacle. My father's memory, my connection to him, my inheritance, it all threatened the future she wanted for herself. I realized then that she had no intention of letting me honor my father's wishes, that she would continue to manipulate and control until she had everything she wanted. "I spoke to Gregory," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "He told me about the will, about the protections my father put in place for me. You can't change those, no matter how much you try to twist things." Her expression hardened, a flicker of genuine hatred flashing in her eyes. "Gregory doesn't know what's best for this family. He's just clinging to your father's outdated plans. Times change, and you need to grow up, Jessie." I shook my head, meeting her gaze with all the strength I could muster. "No, Clara. You're the one who needs to accept the reality. My father didn't trust you, and he made sure I'd be protected from you." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think you can stand up to me? You're nothing without your father's money, without this house. Everything you have, everything you think you're entitled to, exists because I let you stay here. You're not entitled to any of this." The raw disdain in her voice stunned me, but I refused to back down. "This is my father's legacy, Clara, not yours. And I'm not going to let you destroy it just because you feel entitled to take whatever you want." She stared at me, her face a mask of fury. For a long, tense moment, neither of us moved, locked in a standoff that had been building since the day my father died. Finally, she let out a short, harsh laugh, stepping back with a shake of her head. "Fine," she said, her voice cold and final. "If that's how you want it, so be it. But don't expect any support from the rest of the family. They know what kind of person you are now. You'll be on your own soon enough." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me alone. The silence settled around me, heavy and oppressive, but I felt a strange sense of relief. I'd finally seen Clara's true colors, her carefully constructed facade crumbling to reveal the resentment and entitlement that lay beneath. And for the first time, I felt ready to fight back fully, to take the steps necessary to protect my father's legacy. As I stood there, the anger in me turned to resolve. I wouldn't let Clara erase me or my father's memory. She could try to twist the family's perception of me, spread her lies, and play her games, but I wouldn't give her any more control over my life. I had the truth, my father's letter, and Gregory's support, and with that, I knew I had everything I needed to see this battle through to the end. After my confrontation with Clara, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I contacted Gregory, determined to take the final steps to protect my inheritance and secure my place in my father's legacy. Together, we began preparing a formal claim on my father's estate, reinforcing the protections he'd put in place and gathering evidence of Clara's behavior and her attempts to undermine his wishes. Over the next few weeks, I reached out to family members Clara had tried to manipulate. Equipped with my father's letter, I explained the truth of what was happening, showing them the measures my dad had taken to ensure I was looked after. At first, some relatives were hesitant, having already been swayed by Clara's version of events. But as I shared the heartfelt words in my father's letter and described how she'd been removing his belongings and spreading lies about me, they began to understand. With Gregory's help, I also gathered testimonies from a few friends of my father's who had witnessed Clara's behavior over the years, providing further proof of her manipulative nature. The weight of this evidence, coupled with Gregory's credibility as a long-standing family attorney, made it impossible for Clara's influence to hold. Finally, it was time for a formal confrontation. Gregory had arranged a family meeting to discuss the estate, and I knew this was the moment to set things right. Clara arrived, clearly expecting her usual dominance in family matters, her gaze flickering with irritation when she saw Gregory and several relatives gathered, ready to hear the truth. As the meeting began, I took a deep breath and spoke, my voice steady. I want everyone here to know exactly what my father's intentions were. He left clear instructions to ensure I had a rightful place in his legacy, something that Clara has been trying to erase. I pulled out my father's letter, reading the parts where he expressed his love for me and his careful planning to secure my future. Clara's face turned stony as I spoke, and when I finally finished, I looked up, meeting her gaze. This isn't just about money or the estate. This is about respecting his memory and his wishes. Clara's mask of composure cracked, and she couldn't hold back her bitterness any longer. This is absurd, she snapped, looking around the room. He's manipulating all of you. Jesse is just trying to undermine me, trying to make himself look like the victim. But the family members around us exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by her outburst. Gregory then presented the formal legal documents my father had left behind, reinforcing the will's provisions and ensuring that my father's legacy was secure, beyond Clara's reach. The tension in the room was thick, and it was obvious that her story no longer held weight. Seeing that her tactics had failed, Clara turned to me, her expression venomous. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed. "Fine, keep your precious inheritance. But don't think for a second that anyone in this family will stand by you when you fall." The words hit hard, but they didn't break me. I looked back at her calmly, feeling a strange sense of peace. This isn't about winning, Clara. It's about honoring my father's memory and protecting what he wanted for me. I don't need anyone's approval to know I'm doing the right thing. With that, Clara stormed out, her footsteps echoing through the hall as she left. The silence that followed was heavy, but I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. My family members slowly gathered around me, offering quiet words of support and encouragement. I could see the shift in their faces, the understanding that I wasn't the problem here, that I was simply a son fighting for his place in his father's legacy. In the days that followed, the house felt different, lighter. I walked through the rooms, reclaiming memories that Clara had tried to erase. With Gregory's help, I secured the assets and items my father had left to me, keeping the parts of his life that meant the most to us both. For the first time, I could breathe freely, knowing that his legacy was safe. As I stood in his study one evening, looking at a framed photo of us from years ago, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. My father had anticipated everything, preparing me for this moment even when I didn't know it. He'd shown me the power of love, resilience, and faith in doing what was right, no matter the odds. The family, too, gradually began to come back around, understanding the lengths Clara had gone to for her own benefit. I saw the love and respect in their eyes, and I knew that I truly claimed my place in the family, not by force, but by honoring my father's memory and the values he had instilled in me. Moving forward, I was determined to uphold his legacy with integrity, grateful for the support I'd found along the way. And as I closed the study door that night, I felt a quiet peace settle over me, knowing that I'd finally found my rightful place.